Welcome to you all. It's great to be with you and to be asked to take part in this International Interfaith Awareness Week. I've always been very keen that we should, all the organisations should cooperate, and I think it's more than ever important in our very troubled world. So it's great to be with you and share.
Thank you for asking me to be involved in this conversation for Interfaith Awareness Week. It's a real pleasure to revisit some of the stories that we recorded in the biography I wrote about you both, Afternoon Tea with Mary and Marcus, the title of which actually was inspired by Rabbi Ruth Broyd Sharon, who wrote an article about high tea in England with you both. And today I just want to talk about some of your experiences with different interfaith organisations around the world, how they've come together, and some of the people that you've met along the way, stories about the humans behind this big movement towards peace and understanding between different religions. First of all, it'd be lovely to hear about how you began your interfaith journey, and to get some background, I'd love to hear a bit more about your childhood.
I won't give away your age.
Yes, I have to say I'm 3.5 years older than Marcus. Start off with the truth of things. Anyway, I was born in Cambridge in England, and I think you wanted to know some of our experiences of the war, because we were both war children, and my experiences were varied. My dad was away with the Ministry of Aircraft Production, working away on aeroplanes. And so I missed him terribly and developed asthma when I was the age of 4. And the only frightening moment that I really remember is we were evacuated to Exeter and then back to Cambridge again, because Cambridge had less bombs, is being on a railway train and watching Spitfires attacking German planes, and that was really quite frightening.
And what was the war like for you, Grandpa? What do you remember of your childhood around that time?
Well, one of my memories is of regularly being under a table in the nursery. I can still sort of picture the green linoleum as we listened to the doodle-bugs above and whether if they cut out. And so, and our village was bombed. We would have been in holiday in Scotland, and the day before we got back there had been a bomb which did quite a lot of damage at the church and had blown our windows out. So I think one of the things I really couldn't stand was the gas masks. And of course everything at night was dark. You had to have this blackout, there were no street lights and so on. So of course we could see the stars, but there were advantages. No, it was a strange time. We also, were rationing and food parcels, and I think it wasn't until probably about because rationing went on to the mid-1950s. It didn't finish, yeah. And I think I forget when we had the first banana, and I took one mouthful and wasn't quite sure I liked it, and before I could take another one, my sisters had eaten it.
And do you remember, both of you, when the war was over? Do you remember that moment when you heard?
I remember I got involved in celebration societies with my brother, who was 4 years older, and we got together and had great celebrations. I remember VE Day and VJ Day. They were both separate. I don't remember, but I think I was quite upset after VJ Day and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. I remember thinking that seemed a very hard thing to do.
The VJ Day is one of my memories, because we walked right up to the other end of the village. There was this great bonfire and celebration. I suppose I had some idea what it was about.
When you were teenagers, did you have an idea of what you wanted to grow up to do?
I was at a grammar school which was a lot of mixed girls from all sorts of backgrounds, and some of them came from very deprived homes, and it was at that stage I thought in some ways I'd like to be interested in social work. I also was regularly visiting a German Jewish refugee, an old lady who was quite a turbulent, volatile old lady who once threw eggs at me because they weren't the right ones I bought her. But anyway, it was something arranged through the school, and so I got interested in all the, really what I was going to say, intellectual refugees who'd come over from Germany, and later on I got quite involved with that. And I was a St John Ambulance cadet, and so I saw quite a lot of suffering. I even had to do bed baths for men and found that quite embarrassing because I was 15. And then gradually at school I learnt that you could do degrees in sociology and this sort of thing. So I worked towards that. Although I loved languages, I went to France and Spain a lot, did lots of exchanges and loved the languages, but I couldn't think what I'd do with them in the end. So I think it was going to be social work from about 16 onwards. I went to a conference in Berlin organised by the junior branch of the United Nations Association, which was called Council for Education in World Citizenship. And we went to this very interesting meeting in Berlin, which was at the time divided into 4 sectors. We were in the British sector and we were able to get the tube to the eastern sector, which was pretty tough. And it was the most fascinating experience of my life, I think. And I think that was also very much made me want to work with people and refugees and find out more about what was going on in the world.
And you also went to a nightclub.
I went to a nightclub, yes, called Races, where you rang people up and asked them to dance with you. It was quite fun.
I can really remember, I suppose I was about 12 or 13. I was staying with a cousin, and I went off by myself to swim in the swimming pool. And I rather foolishly got out of my depth. I felt I was being a bit overconfident and got splashed. I remember sort of going down at least twice and only just getting to the shore. So the next day, I suppose, I was cycling home, and suddenly the words came to me from the prayer book for General Thanksgiving: to show forth I praise, not only with our lips, but in our lives, by giving up ourselves to your service. And I think I was from a church-going family and so on, and that I think was a moment when I think I wanted to be a vicar, I wanted to be a priest, and I can picture the hill I was cycling up from the green woods on one side. So that was a sort of key moment. And then I got involved in a society, as a youth group linked to a missionary society. So that got me interested in the church and so on. And then one conference was all about relating to other world religions, and that got me excited. And then I went on to university, but in between there were 2 years of national service.
So going into national service, having chosen to work in faith as a career, did you find that your fellow soldiers were understanding of this?
Well, I mean, remember the first night of this great big barracks, and I did manage to kneel down by my bed because I was used to doing that for prayers. I can't think the prayers were much use. On the other hand, we had the chaplains were good, especially I was quite ill at one stage in hospital, and that was good. And so the first part of it, I was in Libya, and that was very, very interesting, and learned that just before rejecting the monarchy, and immediately after the Suez Crisis. So then I was sort of in a remote place in Derna, and so I began to learn something about Muslim culture. And then the second bit, we were moved to Cyprus. This was still when the troubles were going on, and we had to be armed all the time. So I always have sympathy for those caught up in that situation. Britain had decided it was going to leave, and the aim was to try to bring together the Greek community and the Turkish community. Again, we failed in that eventually. And I was working at port security, so we had to search all the sort of luggage and things coming in to see if there was anything in it. And of course, I had to remember whether to ask for Greek coffee or Turkish coffee, depending who I was sitting with. It was a great chance to learn to swim. And what perhaps was most important, looking back, is I had a week's leave in Israel. This was really quite early. Israel was, I think, 9 years old then. And going to see the places where Jesus taught and so on really convinced me of Jesus as a man in that setting. And the other thing, which I'll come back to later, was going to the little museum or chamber of the Holocaust, which at that time nobody talked about it really till the much of the 1960s. and I'd done modern history, but nobody had mentioned it. And going in there and seeing, that the clothes, that the teeth had been taken out, the gold used, and the horror, and that remained with me. And it's I think one reason why I got so involved in Christian-Jewish relations, because so much Christian teaching has had that sort of anti-Jewish element. But that and going to Galilee are things that last.
On the subject of your national service, how did you feel about, were you having to hold a gun? Were you armed a lot of the time?
The thing which really got me, I think, was in the training, being taught how to use a bayonet and how you skewer it round. I still sort of shudder about. I mean, I'm thankful because I always had to have a pistol, but I never had to use it. And the other rather strange thing is, well, two things. One is that a student came and back from Greece where he'd been studying, and because his books he'd got were in Greek, he had to be I had to guard him as a prisoner until somebody could come down and see if they were legitimate. I actually could read Greek. And then I realised they were Thucydides, who was a very sort of controversial person in classical Greek, arguing for democracy and freedom. So perhaps it was subversive. And the whole pilgrims came back from the Holy Land with their water and their Bibles and things. But I was persuaded the officer that the Bibles perhaps well, not really subversive.
And I think I remember you mentioning once about a time when you had to stand out and you felt quite exposed to possible fire from others. What happened there? Do you remember that?
Well, I had this one moment time. You were always meant to be in pairs, and I was somehow sent off to a very lonely bit to see what was being unloaded by myself. And, I was a sitting target. Luckily, nobody had told the people about it. But one of the other good things was, there was a lot, when ships came in to load Cyprus wine, we had to go on board to make sure they weren't unloading anything else. And they gave us enough to drink so that we wouldn't notice.
And during this sort of time for you, when you were going to conferences and pursuing language as well as your understanding of people, I think you've described to me before that you were quite a romantic young woman.
I was. Yes,
she always is.
Well, I was very romantic. I had great ideas about how things should be, and it was in the next 3 years. Of course, I was at university in London, Bedford College, reading sociology, and actually Marcus talking about Turkish coffee reminded me that it was drinking Turkish coffee that get me through my exams actually. At college I was captain of our table tennis team and we went all over playing, but I also chaired the United Nations Association, UNSA, and arranged lots of meetings, and again met lots of people from all different faiths. And that was really exciting and interesting. And it was at the time at university that I actually became a Christian. I had a wonderful experience of Jesus Christ, and that can never be taken away from me. And that's when I made my commitment, because up till then I hadn't. I explored all sorts of possibilities, and I went to lots of different churches, including something called the Christian Community, which is very interesting.
Linked to Rudolf Steiner.
Yes, linked to Rudolf Steiner. So I'd been a Methodist, I'd been a sort of Anglican, I'd been lots of bits and pieces. I had never in my time at that time thought that I would ever marry an Anglican clergyman.
And so what was that experience of Jesus that...
The Christian experience?
Yes, can you describe
Well,
that?
I was all alone in my room in college. I wasn't with anybody. I did have a lot of evangelical friends who were praying. I did go to Billy Graham rallies, but the actual decision was an experience, actually. An experience of complete love and acceptance, which I can't really describe more than that. But it hasn't changed me since. I've never gone back on it, although I obviously have doubts like we all do.
When did you go to Cambridge? When did that
Well, immediately after the national service, I had about 3 weeks. That was really annoyed me, but the flights that were delayed, so I actually spent more than my two years. I was sweating away in Nicosia. But anyhow, I got back in time to start the degree. And I think there were two things taking up what Mary said. One is, it was where I had, I said I was hoping to be a clergyman. And I think at first I was rather pious, always going to chapel, etc., and sort of trying to be good. And then at the one service, I remember in Holy Trinity Church, then Bishop of Coventry, Cuthbert Bardsley, and a wonderful sermon, and he talked about this person in prison who had been forgiven and so on. And I felt then, which transforming experience of knowing I was loved, I was accepted, I was forgiven. Now clearly if you love Jesus, you want to do things that will please him. But there's no longer the sense trying to be good so that you were going to be punished. In fact, and that it's absolutely sort of transforming sense of Christianity, but you know that you are loved. So that was, but the other was for table tennis, because Mary had said she would never marry somebody, she could only marry somebody who could beat her at table tennis. So anyhow, my sister had been at college with her, so that's sort of how we first, she wanted to go around how we first.
Was it college with me?
Yes, with college with Mary.
University.
Yeah.
Susan.
Anyhow, one of my early visits, I actually managed to beat Mary at table tennis.
Have you managed to repeat this marvellous experience?
Very seldom.
Marcus had no idea that I had said that I would marry the man who would beat me at table tennis. And although he did, it took a very long time before it came to reality. I used to go and have lunch with him and his 3 or 4 friends always, weren't there? Because I worked just down the road. And by this time, I'd worked 2 years in London, and I'd now moved back to Cambridge and was living at my parents' home, but fairly independently. And I used to cycle across Cambridge to be. I was a childcare officer dealing with adoption, boarding out of children, and children, very much families with lots of problems, and found a totally different side of Cambridge that I'd never come across because I'd been more involved with the university side, and now I was meeting the real people in Cambridge, and it was really interesting. So we used to meet up. It was a very good time in Cambridge, and I did lots of other things. I ran a Methodist youth club, and I was secretary of something called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was a Christian pacifist. That was quite important actually, because that was where Marcus found he could come and see me, because otherwise he didn't really meet me, did you?
No.
And having been in his national service and not really thought in terms of any sort of Christian pacifism.
Well, my father had been a colonel in the army and so on, so it was that family, and my uncle and so on. So.
But I also ran World Refugee Year in Cambridge, which was sometime in my 20s, and there were lots of things going on. It was a wonderful place to live in. Lots going on, lots of friends and lots of things happening.
Do you remember the first time you both talked about the concept of interfaith together, or at that point was it sort of a movement of so many different pieces it wasn't really a term that was used yet?
It wasn't, no.
I was, as a teenager, I went to a Unitarian church for a time. It was one of my other aspects that I did. And the Unitarian church used to have multi-faith services, so I thought it was quite acceptable. It never occurred to me that people of different faiths shouldn't have services together and be together and work together. So when I met Marcus, it was nothing particularly new.
But I just take up interesting about that word interfaith, when it didn't really began to get used, I suppose, a bit in the 1980s. And there was a whole question whether it was one word or 2 words or hyphenated, and different organisations and so on. And we were doing a book after one of the conferences I'll talk about it, and at that stage we consulted the Oxford English Dictionary and persuaded that it should be one word.
Very in keeping with the
But
theme.
it actually reflects a different sort of feeling, yes. But if you're going again about the interfaith, whilst I was there, there was a group linked to a missionary society, and I would go to that. So that was again the interest. And one of my friends who was part of that applied for a World Council of Churches scholarship to India, and that gave me the idea, well, I would apply too. And to my great surprise, I was given that scholarship, which takes me out to India, which we'll come to.
Whilst Marcus was away in India, can you tell me a bit more about your refugee work?
Yes, well, I worked quite a lot with Sue Ryder and Canon Raven, Charles Raven, and his wife Helen Shaunty Raven, who also worked a lot with the refugees coming over from Germany, and I spent quite a lot of time with that. But what I wanted to say was that all the people you meet, people are people, whatever their backgrounds, and I don't actually differentiate between people. I love people of any background, and it doesn't really make any difference to me whether they're wealthy or good or whatever. And as a social worker, I met so many interesting people who really have been through really bad times, and I realised that there but for the grace of God go I quite often. And there's one funny little story. Well, there were lots of funny little stories, but one was in taking a boy of, I think he was 7 or 8. He was autistic, and I was taking him to a special school in Surrey from Cambridge in the train, and we were in a carriage with a lot of businessmen reading newspapers, and he behaved quite badly and made quite a lot of noise, and they all looked very crossly at me as this, thinking I was his mum, I think. Well, I was quite young, really. I was only about 23. Anyway, I suppose I could have been his mum, but I'd been very young when I had him. And so they looked at me very disapprovingly. And then suddenly he got up, this little boy. They were all trying to read their newspapers, which is what they always did in the train. And he bashed all their newspapers. He hit them all. And they all put their newspapers down, looked at me and roared with laughter. So thank goodness, it was quite embarrassing. You never know what you're going to encounter. Because they were all quite nice to me after that. And I didn't tell them the story. They didn't know he wasn't my child. Nothing to do with them. And on another train, actually, I was travelling with my boss, a man who was just sort of coming to see how I was getting on, I think. And a man came up to me on the train and said, "You're a social worker, aren't you?" And I said, "How on earth? What makes you think I am?" And he said, "Well, you're wearing a pendant, and you just look like a social worker." So I said, "Well..."
Scruffy.
Scruffy. Oh, I was reading The Guardian, that's right. And anyway, so I thought that was it. And he said, "I've just escaped from a mental hospital. Can you sort me out?" And talked to me for quite a bit, and in the end I rang up the hospital and told them where he was and what was happening. So it was quite an interesting encounter. You never know what's going to happen. And my boss, who came with me, took no notice at all. He said, "Well, you were dealing with it, I didn't need to deal with it."
One of the things I've always loved about you, Grandma, is that you're very good at talking to people on a level of depth that I think a lot of people, when they first meet someone, they sort of go straight to the small talk and they stay on that level. But you always engage in really meaningful conversations.
I really want to know who they are and why they are, because it's no good saying you know somebody if you don't know anything about them.
So that curiosity about people and about understanding different perspectives has been with you right since you were a child.
Yes, it started very young. Yeah. I was going to reform the world when I was about 8.
So at this time, when Mary is dealing with all of that, so you're in India at the moment. So how is that experience? I think I remember when you arrived, there was a bit of a panic about finding you a proper bed.
Oh yes. Well, I was going to say, I was the only white student there and so on, so that was interesting. And I was put in the student hostel because, I mean, the staff were very kind and so all right to me out. But the wife of the principal didn't think a white person could sleep on the floor. I could have done. Anyhow, so we went out about what was everybody called was a cot, which was a sort of, it was a bit like a giant cot. So that was very interesting. No, this was Madras Christian College, or Chennai now, which was one of the colleges sort of founded in the 1850s, 1860s, finding the sort of first universities in India. And a lot of people who worked there were from Scotland missionary. But right from the beginning, it was very open and concerned to be part of a society. And it was the first place, I think, where there was a common kitchen, because you know about all the caste rules. And so this was in the 1880s, a great storm they had then, but they insisted that anybody coming there must eat with everybody else. So it was a fascinating experience, and I had this very distinguished Hindu professor who sort of introduced me to a lot of the Hindu writings, particularly a person called Sri Ramakrishna, who lived in the early 19th century, who claimed he'd had an experience of the divine in each religious path, in Hinduism, Christianity, and so on. So I learnt about that. I also learnt about some of the mystics and the saints, and it really convinced me that there's a reality of God's presence in other faith traditions. I think I was always open to that, but at that time the dominant view in was Christianity is right, everybody else is wrong. It seems to me strange that the God of love should, yes, but anyhow, so that's a sort of major issue. But what, two other things I went to. One very important for me was we went to help at a leprosy clinic, and that was great. So I must say I was really quite anxious the first time and scrubbed myself when I got back. I'm so silly, but anyhow. But we went, and one time I went with a student one student was from Sri Lanka, another Muslim student, and there was the Hindu doctor wearing the traditional dhoti. And I think the vision came to me then, surely the religions of the world should come together to work for the healing of the world. But I realised, and so really my interest in interfaith has always been primarily as a step towards helping to heal civil disobedience, poverty, injustice, and so on. But to do that, the religions themselves had to begin to come together. And the book I wrote then, Together to the Truth, afterwards, I had this picture that as we faced common problems, so we would come more together, which has, I think, in part happened. But what was also very valuable is that I travelled around a lot, around India. It so happened that my professor's brother was head of an India Rail Board. So he arranged for sort of minions at different stations around India for me to go and stay there with him. I mean, I always travelled third class, which was fascinating. If I could get up on the top bunk, I did. But it gave me a great chance to meet people, all the different, I mean, it was different. One family would receive me and assumed because I was English I had to have roast beef. But another one, the person apologised that we were having a meal in a cafe, because if I went to the house, his grandmother would walk out because the whole house had been polluted by a foreigner. So these different things. But I also, very interesting, met a person called Father Murray Rogers, who was really one of the pioneers of bringing people together, and had this ashram, which is a traditional Indist community. It was a Christian ashram, but it had all that sort of openness, and he really encouraged me to look for the spiritual meeting, the spiritual, because really religions all point beyond themselves. So. No, it was a very interesting year, and we've been back to the college sometimes. But
and I think you found it quite difficult to settle with all the different denominational and complicated things that exist in institutions, didn't she?
Oh, because that's the other point. The church there was the newly formed Church of South India, which was a united church. Methodists, Anglicans and others had come together. But one more story. Christmas I spent with this student's family. He was a Methodist minister, right, in various sort of remote villages. And he asked me to come and talk at another village. So we set out. It was just a very narrow path. On the way, there was a snake got in the way. But anyhow, when we went over the final bridge and went there, and I started talking, and all the children started giggling. Then I suddenly realised that they'd never seen anybody speak English before. Well, like if you have television on without the sound. And that sort of sense of remoteness. But it gets me really a sort of deep concern for interfaith understanding, but the interfaith understanding which issues in concern for the poor and for peace. I think I've always been interested more in the mystical, in that experience of the divine and divine love, rather than in the doctrines. And I think many of the mystics of every generation talk about that experience of love. There was a book by a person called Manickavasika, who wrote, I think, in about the 12th century. And reading that, he goes on talking about the amazing love of God. He was one of the Tamil South Indian saints. But it's obviously a genuine experience in another tradition. So for me, there's that whole area of spiritual meeting, retreats, praying together, has been more interested in comparing sort of doctrines and so on.
Can I just add to that because I agree entirely with that, but we did have quite a lot of opposition in our interfaith work when we first started it. We had quite poison letters, and there were a lot of people, and there still are a lot of people who are still hostile.
The really rude letters always end up, "You're beloved in Christ." But we also had a protest at one time, because we were also pioneering interfaith services where people of different faiths came together, because we thought there was only one God, but anyhow. But we had protests from some Christians about it, and a lot of opposition in the early years, the whole idea of being able to pray together, even the thought that you could visit another Hindu temple or something. And gradually, and it's amazing how things have changed, and I'm thankful for that.
So some of the basis in the beginning of your work in interfaith was perhaps then the understanding that instead of people of different faiths talking over one another to say what their perspective is, it's a dialogue beginning and a listening to one another to improve the understanding and to work together towards particular issues in the world. Yeah. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. At the beginning, everybody expressed what their religion was, but they didn't necessarily bring it together.
Yes, sort of one of those situations where you're waiting for somebody else to speak rather than actually listening to what they're saying.
Oh yes, I must give you one example of that. I was asked to preach at a Unitarian chapel. It was the interfaith service, and there was somebody from each of the religions, and they all seemed to think they had to explain the whole history of their religion. So after about 2 hours, it came to my turn to preach. I couldn't decide whether anybody would want to listen. On the other hand, it seemed to be rude to the people who asked me not to say something.
But you did preach a bit.
I preached fairly brief sermon. I was hungry.
Do you mind just talking a bit more about the Sue Ryder work that you did?
Sue Ryder is a very, very special lady who gave her life, devoted her life really to offering places for people to live. And we used to help her paint houses and that sort of thing. And some of these people, for these refugees who came over, lived in them. And she did a lot to help them and sort them out and find them recreations or find them jobs, whatever they needed. And she worked really hard. That was the sort of lady she was. And she used to get lots of volunteers to help. Sue Ryder homes still exist now. I used to work in one in Oxfordshire.
You mentioned as well that in India so being there with was it a Hindu doctor and was it people from different faiths all working together in the same place? Was it strange then coming back to England and experiencing a more strict version of denominations and churches within their own bubbles?
Yes, I mean, I've always would have liked to have been ordained to the Church of South India, but I was told that would be a sort of legal impossibility if I wanted to be a priest in England.
And you wanted to be ordained there because it was...
Because it was a united church, and I've always felt I was part of that united church. One of the things I would like to mention, though, that it was in the Church of South India that I first encountered the peace, which didn't really come into England for another 20, 30 years. During the communion service, Christians very often just sort of share their peace. And of course, in that context of people being untouchables, it was a really revolutionary move. And so it was very, very important. So lots of those sort of things. And lay people were able to help with the communion then. It was, and also their liturgy actually was really the first for all the new reformed liturgies which many of the churches have adopted. So it was a very significant, at that stage, a sort of very hopeful moment.
When you first got to India as well, were you received by somebody quite special?
When we went to Delhi, the brother arranged for me to be received by Dr. Radhakrishnan, who was the president of India. So we were welcomed in to the... at the time, I hadn't realised he was one of the people who took part in the First World Congress of Faith meeting, and he was this very distinguished philosopher and so on. But what I particularly remember is when we'd had this sort of nice chat and a cup of tea, he just walked to the door with us, which, that sort of humility. And then later on, he came to the college whilst I was there. Absolute, got everything ready for him. Tea outside, absolute downpour. But in India, rain is auspicious. So it's a sign of God's blessing.
And so while you were still out in India, were you at all in contact with Mary?
Yes, I always looked forward to her blue airmail arriving, and that was great. It was great excitement, and I wrote regularly, and I think we've still got a lot of the letters and so on. I think I was rather too descriptive of places I was going to, and could have been more romantic. That was not my style of letter writing.
Definitely.
That's true, is it?
Yes.
And at one stage, you hoped you might have come out to join me.
Yes, I would very much love to have gone to join Marcus, but my mother got ill and it made it quite difficult. She didn't like me travelling. She, although she'd married an Australian, she'd never been over to Australia. Well, they couldn't afford it, and of course it was the war and everything. But she didn't really like me travelling, or my brother.
And so going back to Cambridge from India, had you already fallen in love with Mary at this point, or?
No. We had about we had fallen in love, but we hadn't got to a stage of a sort of formal
engagement.
Engagement, yes, and that was slightly difficult because it was just after Christmas, and I went and I hoped to get her father's consent. He proceeded to spend the whole afternoon under his car, fiddling around with it. And we got more and more hoping with... I think eventually I got under the car too and asked him, and he agreed. And at that stage we rushed to the jewellers just before they closed and bought that engagement ring. But about a month before that, Mary had come to stay with me at Wells Theological College, and we went for a walk, and it was a muddy field, and we were chased by cows, so I was very surprised that she continued.
Most of the walks he took me on were quite muddy.
And Grandpa, had Marcus previously said anything to you that indicated he wanted to propose?
Oh yes, many years before, when we first met, he said, "Shall we share our lives together?" Which I thought was an interesting kind of proposal.
And what did you say?
Oh, we were talking about the fact that you also hoped to be a missionary.
Yes, that's right. How did I feel then? I thought, well, he's a really lovely person, but he's not somebody. He's far too young for me. He's 3.5 years younger.
I couldn't
At that
have supported
stage-
her.
What?
I said I couldn't have supported her any.
No, that wasn't the reason, because I could have supported you.
Yes.
It was just, it hadn't occurred to me. All the friends I'd had been older, so it was something I had to get used to. It did take quite a long time.
And from there, what was the wedding itself like?
Well, you said it to begin with. The thing is, I was going to a Methodist church at the time, and Marcus, as you've heard, is very ecumenical anyway. So I wanted to get married in my Methodist church because I was very much part of it at that time. And Marcus agreed. I mean, as I say, I had not ever thought of becoming an Anglican, which is interesting at that stage. But so we thought that we would like to have a communion service. And Marcus's new vicar in Highgate, where we were going, had said he would be very happy to help celebrate. And my Methodist minister was very keen, thought it was a good idea. But Marcus's vicar felt he had to write to the Bishop of Ely to get permission. And the Bishop of Ely refused permission because of the delicate situation between the Anglicans and the Methodists. And I was very, very angry. And I wrote several letters and have copies back from the bishop about it.
See, at that stage we thought the Church of England and Methodist Church were going to unite, and very soon after there was a vote, which a majority was in favour, but not a 2/3 majority. And so 50 years more than that, we still haven't united, and I think that's been one of the reasons why both churches have declined, because it could have given so much new energy and saved so many resources and things. But anyhow, one of the sadnesses. But we still are, hopefully we're still a sort of pioneers.
But later, at Wells Theological College, I did become ordained.
She joined the True
Not
Church.
ordained. I didn't become ordained, I became confirmed. Never wanted to be ordained.
So despite the disappointment with not being able to have a service that reflected both of the denominations, you were successfusly married and you began your married life
Well,
together?
there was another problem, because in the London diocese at the time, somebody during their first year as what we call a deacon was not allowed to marry. There was a sub-bishop who we were talking to, and he knew we'd been together for some time, so initially he wrote to the Bishop of London, who still refused. So, oh well, then you have to put off your ordination, won't you, and get married?
Yes, so we did that first.
Which was probably just as well. It was lovely. It was so much easier actually going to a parish married than having everybody sort of gossiping.
And so, what was it like then, settling into your first parish together? As it was your first for a lot of things, isn't it?
Well, it was amazing, really, because Marcus is the sort of person who gets on with everything, doesn't mess around. And we got pregnant on the honeymoon when we were abroad. We went to Austria, and anyway, we got pregnant with Rachel, our daughter, and then, amazingly, 11.5 months later, I had another baby, a little boy. So we got on with our babies. We only wanted 2 babies, and they came.
Despite your reading matter.
Despite my reading matter, which was we would probably have to adopt, because I had placed so many babies for adoption with couples who couldn't have babies. I was really surprised that it all happened so quickly.
These are books she took on the honeymoon.
No pressure then.
But then, because it was a privilege.
Not any pressure at all.
Privileged to be able to take services, but after a month, the vicar went to Australia, did an exchange for about 5 months. Then a lovely Australian vicar and so on came, but I had to take much more responsibility earlier. One of the things we were responsible for was taking funerals at Highgate Cemetery, which is a very famous cemetery, and it also has a great statue of Karl Marx, where Karl Marx was buried. And I remember it was down the hill, we were going wearing my black cassock, and there were some Russian visitors who all got their cameras out to see this archaic custom. But no, it was a rich area. So there were people. Yehudi Menuhin, very famous musician. He was a parishioner. There were some members of Parliament and so on. And the brother of the Dean of St Paul's Cathedral, and so I was invited to preach at St Paul's as a curate. So all sorts of. So there were some very wealthy people, and then much poorer. And I think we very quickly discovered that the rich people have just as many personal problems as anybody else. So I think it helped us, both of us, to treat everybody sort of in the same sort of way, and not be afraid of the powerful. Oh, do say it about
at least we were asked out. Well, we were asked out by all sorts of people, met all sorts of lovely people, and they were really kind. They gave us a baby shower. They really looked after us. They paid for me to have the nappy service so I could go to church. But one of the days we were invited out to lunch when the children were 1 and 2,
yes.
or perhaps 1.5, 2.5, and by the chairman of the Times, in a very beautiful house. It was wonderful silver. It was all laid out. It was terribly posh with a butler and everything else. And I looked at this table and I looked at the children.
Well, they'd laid a full place for each child.
For each child, and I just sort of said, I'm not quite sure that my children will quite cope with this. And so he said, oh, would you like the butler to look after them? And so they went downstairs and had a lovely time.
Well, besides the church work, there were two interesting things happened. One, I got very involved in Christian Aid, which was a very new organisation then, and it helped also to bring all the churches together, and that's been a continuing concern. And it's also where I joined the World Congress of Faiths. Having come back from India, I was keen to go on reading and learning more about Indian religions, and I happened to see one day a tiny little advertisement on the front page of the Times about the World Congress Library. So I got in touch and went there, and then the lecturer then was actually a very well-known person at the time, Geoffrey Parender, who had been a great pioneer of the studies, and so for that he was welcomed me to do an MPhil, a master's degree, and so on. So and then almost a year later, I was asked to become one of the honorary secretaries, which is all sort of quite bewildering. We powerful, and I became responsible for arranging conferences, which were a great feature. And Mary was absolutely wonderful in looking after people. So it's a significant 3 years.
So, after 3 years in Highgate, you then moved to Medway Towns. So what was that like to live and to work around?
Well, it was very different for both of us. Do you want to, shall I say a tiny bit about me? Yes, well, having gone to the Medway Towns, our children were coming up to 2 and 3. Somebody came and knocked on the door and said, please, we hear you're a social worker, done childcare, will you come back to work? And I said, well, they're very young. And eventually, I mean, it was almost straight away, I did go back to work part-time, just 10 hours a week, which came up to 15 hours, which went up to, in the end, to 30 hours. And I found 2 friends who were in the Wives' Fellowship in Strood, Finsbury, which was a part of the Medway Towns, the other side of the Medway. Quite the poor relation of the Medway Towns, really, wasn't it? And I found these friends who looked after the children just for 2 days a week, and they'd got each other, which so I felt they'd be all right, and they seemed to be all right, because I felt a bit guilty going back when they were so young. And absolutely loved the work. It was back to childcare again, and went on doing it, and gradually rose up to becoming an acting team leader of a whole group of social workers and home care organisers, and did all the supervising and that sort of thing before we moved again.
And then hands.
Oh, well, the big thing was, yes, because it was such a really deprived area, almost worse than where I'd worked in Hackney in London. I actually, with one of the member of our clergy team, Peter Absalom, wonderful man, he set up a scheme called Hands, which was a volunteer helping somebody who needed help, but they were equal. And we had up to 600 volunteers in the end in this amazing area, and it spread, this Hands scheme, of people being helped who were really in need. It was one of the best schemes I think I've ever worked with. And I provided the problems, and he sorted them out with his volunteers.
Amazing. And how long were you involved in HANDS?
5 years.
It was interesting, it was very experimental, because it was one of the first what you call team ministries, because traditionally there's been a vicar responsible for one parish. Things have changed, but this great area of Medway, Finsbury and Strood, about 40,000 people or so on, there was, I think, 6 or 7 of us, and we worked as a team. And so instead of having a boss vicar, the leadership moved round. I mean, there was somebody who was the leader, but he would recognise, say, that Peter Abson mentioned, got far more experience at that and so on. So we worked as a real team. I was also still involved with the World Congress of Faith. We do some work there, and it was there I had a chance to go to a conference in India, a great Sikh conference at Patiala. But maybe we come back to that. But also I helped at teaching one of the schools, so that was interesting, getting used to teaching with teenage girls and so on. So it's a very varied and very...
In Gravesend as well. What about Gravesend?
Also, yes, and also Medway Towns itself was beginning to become slightly multiracial. There was quite a community of those people from Bangladesh. Now this was a time before Bangladesh had separated from Pakistan, and there'd also been devastating floods, so we got to know them well. There was also a Sikh community, a small one, and we offered them the use of our church hall. That proved to be extremely controversial. At the time we were meeting in the back room of a pub, and so Peter Abson, as mentioned, I wrote a letter, because there was criticism about this, letter to the Times, which was published. And we sent a copy to the bishop, and he said, "It's not very often I read something in the Times before I read my own correspondence." So all these issues, another issue was question, churches which were run on buildings, chapels, and one, could they be sold to Muslims to turn to a mosque? It was a period of all that sort of beginning of adjustment, and we were very much involved in that. So it was very stimulating experience, if exhausting.
And eventually, for other reasons, we moved. But before we moved, it was the time the Ugandan nations were coming over to this country. And so, in a way, I was very lucky, because usually when you move, you have to clean up the house and get it ready for the next person. Not that there was anybody following us immediately. So our house was used by the Ugandan nation community, and very much appreciated. And I didn't have to clean it out, because they said they'd do it. They moved in an hour after we left. So it was interesting.
Well, perhaps I was also chairman of the Christian Aid Freedom from Hunger, and we had a shop, but also this covered the whole Medway Towns. So in April, a great lorry would arrive with about 70,000 leaflets and 70,000 envelopes, which I had then to get distributed to all the churches. But we raised a lot of money for work in Uganda, and also, I mentioned that visit to India. I managed to go to a village, besides the conference, where we had sent money for a great well digging machine, and to go there the first time they'd had fresh water, so the children didn't have to go off and collect it. They could start growing vegetables and so on. So one really saw what was going on. The other thing I would like to mention is the Biafra war in Nigeria was going on, great sort of problems. So John Bickersteth, who was our bishop at one stage, who was a friend, he and I went to see our Ann Kerr, who was our MP, an extremely left-wing Labour. And so she then just rang up Harold Wilson, our Prime Minister, told him what we thought and what he ought to be doing. And I don't think we did do a bit more aid to Biafra after that.
That's probably one of the most proactive politicians I think I've heard of, actually doing something there and then.
Wonderful.
But it's so amazing. She could just speak to him. I think she was such a nuisance that he knew it was better to answer.
And the conference in India, so just going into that, that was to mark an anniversary?
Yes, it was an anniversary of the birth of Guru Nanak. And there was a conference when I met a whole lot of scholars from different places, and also was a wonderful, Guru Nanak's birthday we were celebrating, but also, who was the founder of Sikhism, but also another of Guru Gobind Singh. They were dedicating a great special sort of bhavan, which was sort of built like a hand, sort of praying, and each bit of it had sort of 5 for each of the religions. So it's a place for study, individuality, but also the coming together. And we also had a very delayed trip, as these things are, to Amritsar, so got a sort of first glimpse of the Golden Temple. So it was, no, but I think in preparing for it, I sort of found the emphasis of the experience of Guru Nanak, the spiritual experience, and it had some relation to young husband who was the founder of the World Congress of Faiths. And I think it sort of helped convince me it's not doctrines and teachings primarily which matter, they reflect some sort of spiritual experience. And if you begin to see that area, you see there's far more togetherness between the different religions than in terms of doctrines and so on, because Guru Nanak had this mystical experience. He sort of disappeared for 3 days, and his life was completely changed, and he became a sort of great leader of his group, really trying to bring Muslims and Hindus together. He wasn't expecting to form another religion. One other thing, I managed to, besides seeing the well, which I mentioned, to go back to Madras Christian College. And I'd been working at London University for a master's degree, and one of the people I particularly got to know had become the editor for the Christian Literature Society. So I thought I'd go and see whether he might be interested in publishing my thesis. But he wasn't there. I had one more day, should I trail into Madras again or not? I did, and he accepted it. And so that became my first book, Together to the Truth. There was one further problem, though, that having sent me the proofs, there was then 3 months postal strike, so I couldn't send them back. You remember that?
I do remember, yeah.
But so Together for Truth, and I think still very much, because what I was arguing there was that the different religions were in fact coming together because they live in the same world. And in one sense we can see each religion now has a focus, say, on environment, which they didn't have. So, and I was very pleased to see it was quoted by some book recently. Well, I was vicar of these 3 lovely villages, and whilst I was there, George Appleby had been Bishop of Jerusalem, retired as chair, and I was honorary secretary, and he suggested I should become chair, which was very surprising. I think I was only about 38, 39. And gradually from then we began to link with other ones. One of the first one was the Temple of Understanding. It was founded by an amazing woman called Juliet Hollister. And I was invited to go to their second summit conference, which was in Geneva. But it was very expensive. And so one of my friends, who was involved in the hotel business, just thought she would write to the manager of a hotel, saying there's this poor curate wanting to come to a meeting. He's going to have to sell their church candlesticks to get there, etc., etc. Anyhow, we got a 50% reduction. But it was very interesting going around Geneva, meeting others, and so we began World Congress of Faiths work very closely with the Temple of Understanding, and then fairly soon afterwards, the World Conference of Religion and Peace, which was very much initiated in Japan and American Unitarians, and specifically, really, to oppose nuclear weapons and the arming. And that was very interesting.
And that's now Religions for Peace, isn't it?
That's now Religions for Peace. But also, I had a sabbatical, which was in Tantor Centre in Jerusalem, in Israel, and you had to cope with the parish and everything.
I had to run the parish, and I turned down a rather good job that Marcus was offered, because we'd only just moved and I felt it was inappropriate. didn't
It
consult.
was head of a theological college, but anyhow.
So the letter came in the post, you read it and were like, oh no.
Well, no, they rang up and I
She
said,
just said
no.
no. But no, I'd say more when we come to the Council of Christian Jews about the time in Israel, but it was a wonderful, informative time. Rachel and Jeremy came, and it was, I think, about the day before Rachel's 12th birthday, because she got half fares if we went there. And it was a marvellous experience at Tom Tour, being a part of the Palm Sunday procession and so on. But that sort of, again, strengthened my interest in and led to the CCJ.
While you were in Swainswick, your work, Mary, was continuing.
Yes, I was sad to give up my work in the Midway Towns. I'd really enjoyed that. And so I actually did a postgraduate course at Bath University for a certificate of qualification in social work, which I'd never had after my sociology degree because I'd always managed to get jobs. And that was very interesting, but it meant that Marcus had more to do with looking after the children as well. But we were right on the spot. The children's school was right next door to our rectory, and it was a very happy 5 years we had there. And then after I'd done my course, I immediately got a job at the Royal United Hospital in Bath, and that's when I began all my hospital social work, which I did most of the time ever after that, apart from some spells in general practitioner surgeries. I worked in all sorts of hospitals. I think I've worked in about 12, 14 different hospitals, and it's all been, I've been very lucky, able to get jobs wherever Marcus was, with a hospital near where we worked, mostly for Wiltshire County Council. I also I was put forward by the parish council to be a magistrate, so I became a magistrate on the Bath bench, which was interesting. A magistrate is an unpaid part-time job, and you deal with 96% of the crime and traffic offences in the area.
Is it was it similar to how you expected it to be, or was it quite a
I had to do a lot of training. There's a lot of work learning. Obviously you're not legal, and you do have advice from a legal advisor, but you do have to know quite a lot about the law, and you have to make pronouncements and deal with the youth as well as and family welfare and that sort of thing. Quite interesting. And we also attended the Crown Court in Bristol from time to time. And I have a lovely story there where I went on a sentencing court where with another magistrate, and there was a judge who thinks they're very high and mighty, and the magistrate and I disagreed with the judge's decision about the sentencing, what should happen to the offender, and we won because it was 2 against 1. That was a great triumph. Bob Holman was my professor at Bath University. Lovely man. We had some excellent lecturers, but he was really outstanding and a very committed Christian. And he came round one day, and he was a good, bright, intelligent professor. And he was talking about social work and all that we were doing. And after a lot of discussion, I said to him, well, why don't you do some, real social work rather than being a professor? And he laughed. And very soon afterwards, he went to Glasgow and did some enormously good social work there with his wife, which I'm sure I don't have was my influence, but he did certainly do that. Sadly, he's now died.
So what else happened while you were in Swainswick?
Well, there was a funny incident, really, in that I went to represent the World Congress of Faiths in America at Cornell University, and I travelled in an aeroplane with Bishop George Appleton and Sister Frula Khan, who were charming to me, but Marcus didn't come to that, and Marcus stayed at home and looked after the children. And the local newspaper said, Mrs. Mary Braybrooke has gone away to America and left her husband with the 2 children. Some people misinterpreted it, thought I wasn't coming back.
This was to a meeting of the Temple of Understanding.
Yes, it was a Temple of Understanding meeting, yes.
But you did come back.
I did come back. It was only a fairly short meeting. It was very interesting. It was quite good for me to go on my own.
And good for me to learn to cope.
When did you leave Swainswick, and where did you go after that?
Well, the bishop rang up. He wanted to become director of training. And the job of director of training was to encourage clergy and laity to learn more about their faith and so on. It was very much around the diocese. I mean, I helped a bit at one of the parish churches, and obviously with the cathedral nearby, we went to quite a lot of the things there. Mary was actually much more involved in Wells.
I loved Wells because all the clergy from all over the diocese used to pop in, tell me all their problems and chat. And I also got a job at changed hospitals. I worked at Porton Hospital and St Martin's Hospital in Bath and travelled a bit. So it was very satisfactory. I loved Wells.
And selecting clergy in the Aston Street.
Oh, I became a clergy selector.
But I continued with my work for the World Congress of Faiths. And what also, I was able to go invited to one of the World Council of Churches meetings, which involved Christians from all over the world, which was in Canada. And that was a very exciting, interesting experience. And particularly involved in the group which was trying to get the church to be a bit more aware of other religions and so on. And we made some progress, but people were still very surprised because there was a lot of feeling still then that the only saviour was Jesus Christ, and therefore, but the other real highlight of it was that Desmond Tutu, as we mentioned, who was then by then Archbishop of Cape Town, he was a great problem. He wanted to come to it. The South African government were refusing him a visa, being annoying as possible. Now, at the conference site, there was a lovely tent where we had all our worship. And suddenly one evening, when the message went round, Desmond Tutu's coming. And so we met together, the whole lot, at midnight, when he just arrived. And such an amazing speech, sort of talking about the terrible prejudice of colour, you know, whatever hair you have, whatever colour, your skin, your being sighted. So that was a very, very special moment. And of course we already knew him, so that made it even more special.
Moving towards sort of the Council of Christian and Jews, so after Wells there was quite a big change in your work.
Yes. Well, the pattern of work was changing in the diocese, and I said the sabbatical in Israel at Tantor, and the new person who became head of that, who had become a great friend, he wanted me to go out and work there. But the centre was actually controlled by American University, and it went backwards and forwards, and they didn't really want to have a British takeover. So after about 6 months, that didn't work out, and I wasn't quite sure. And then I got this surprise thing. Would I go for an interview about the Council of Christians and Jews? Now, we'd been a member of it, and so I had to go up to this office in Mayfair. I thought I was just going to meet and sort of be told about it. And there was this select group of very sort of wealthy and important people who were there actually to interview me and so on, the Archbishop and former Archbishops. So I was sort of suddenly thrust into a totally new world. It meant commuting to London, no travelling around, and really trying first of all to enter a bit into the intricacies of Jewish life and so on, the issues. And it was a period actually of great focus on, we had the Archbishop and so on, are supportive, a real change in the attitudes that quite a lot of the church were beginning to recognise that the Jewish religion was still a true and valid religion, that the historical attitudes were wrong. And we also had, it was quite amusing, we had this dinner, a fundraising dinner, with the Speaker of House of Commons invited us to. Then two of the Orthodox Jews, who we hoped were going to make a very big donation, said they needed a kosher meal. And that was a real problem with the Parliament's security system, but they couldn't let anything into the building which hadn't been inspected. But they did in the end agree, at which stage those two potential donors said they were only coming if everybody had a kosher meal. And I said we gave up on them. But it was an absolutely fascinating experience. And one of the things I'm particularly pleased about is that when I went to meet the chief rabbi, he said something I would really love to get to know as the Archbishop. Well, that surprised me. I assumed they were in touch. I think occasionally they appeared on the same platform and so on, but they never had a conversation. So we managed to arrange a meeting of the various presidents, the head of the Church of Scotland and others, three churches, and that's something which has gone on, and I think it was the beginning of a real sort of change in relationships. And it was also the anniversary of Kristallnacht. This was a great time in right in Germany, when all the windows of Jewish shops and everything was smashed and killed. And so, and the third thing which was interesting, at that time the correspondent of the Times, Clifford Longley, was very, very interested in Christian-Jewish relations. And Terry Waite, who of course eventually was kidnapped and so on, he was the chief of staff for the Archbishop. And one of the issues he raised was that a Palestinian bishop came to London and was received by the Archbishop. At that stage, PLO and Palestinians were regarded as an illegal body. So I had to try and sort of put the Christian Jewish point of view as tactfully as I could, and was quoted on the front page of the Times and so on. Terry Waite, with the Archbishop, had to defend the Archbishop. And then that evening I rang him up and sort of said, we both laughed and said, well, we try to make it as moderate as possible. But it was interesting discovering that sort of relationship of power and so on. And I think it was a time of real progress, so it was, well, it was hard for Mary, but she got very involved. And the chairman at the time was Lord Coggan, a former Archbishop, who became very fond of you.
I got very fond. I looked after him. He was very nice. He called me his mother.
And are there other people within sort of that you met around the Council of Christians and Jews who you've sort of worked with since to do with interfaith, or like Sir Sigmund Sternberg?
One of the key people was Sir Sigmund Sternberg, who interestingly he was from Hungary and he only just escaped the German invasion. He was told by his mother to get on this train, but the train was on a Friday, Shabbat, and so he wouldn't go. She then got his rabbi to give him permission. So he got on the train. After 2 hours he got off and went back because he couldn't bear to leave his mother. She immediately packed him off on the next train, which was the last one to get through. And so he got to England and gradually sort of made a lot of money. But then he became very committed to the whole work of relationships with Jews and Christians, and became a papal knight. But also he got, when I was involved, much more interest in other religions, and we began to get the International Council of Christians and Jews began to involve Muslims. But what then happened after I had to leave because of illness and so on, one of my successors decided that CCJ should focus on the specific issue of Council of Christians and Jews. So after a couple of years, Sir Sigmund Sternberg and Zaki Badawi, who is an outstanding leading Muslim, had decided they ought to make a Free Faiths forum. And Siggy rang up and said, yes, you'll be the other co-sponsor, won't you? It was quite difficult to hear on the telephone, and I wasn't quite sure what I'd agreed to because I was doing something else. I suddenly found out one of the three co-founders. But that was again extremely...
Well, the Free Faiths Forum it was called then.
Called then the Free Faiths Forum, and later, as its work extended, Faith and Belief Forum.
And it's a very active group. Very impressive. Very
much working with young people and so on. Mm-hmm. So a lot of sort of things which were important sort of seemed to happen accidentally.
So while Marcus was going backwards and forwards to London, what else was occurring with you?
Well, I was lucky enough to leave the very nice hospital, Paulton Hospital in Avon, and move to Bradford-on-Avon Hospital and Trowbridge Hospital in Wiltshire, which was much nearer Box, where we were now living. So I carried on with my medical social work, but just in different hospitals. And this time I had a maternity hospital as well, so it was very interesting.
You retired a bit sooner than you were expecting to.
Yes, well, I suddenly came home one day with great sort of heart pains and so on. The doctor was very worried and so on. And after a time, he, with the bishop, decided I should take early retirement. But I was allowed to continue to do some light work, because I was already partly looking after a special church, Christ Church in Bath, because at that stage I thought to do something was therapeutic. But the conditions were much more generous then, with welfare provision.
And also during this time, during 1986, it was the World Day of Prayer for Peace in Assisi, so do you want to...
Yes, this was whilst we were at CCJ, where Pope John Paul II convened this World Day of Prayer for Peace. And this was in Assisi, of course, where St. Francis was born. And this was one, people of all religions were invited to come there. And it was great. They started at one church, maybe down in their sort of country, and they processed right up to Assisi on the hill. Then there were different groups for each religion, and then we all came together. And you had some story about the Buddhist.
Yes, the Pope walked with us. We all walked together, but we fasted during the day. But in the evening we were offered bread and water, and one of the Buddhist monks grinned and said, "How wonderful, I've now received communion from the Pope."
And it's interesting that almost a month afterwards, the first meeting of Ronald Reagan with the Russian leader, and I remember Lord Ennals being asked by a reporter, did the prayers make any difference? He said, "Well, I think they did."
So during your so-called retirement, what were you up to?
Well, I was still looking after the church in Bath, Christ Church, but also I was trying to continue to bring the different interfaith organisations together. And we had 2 meetings at a retreat centre called Amadan, which was just outside Bath. So we invited people from the various international interfaith bodies and others. And what I think was very remarkable was we spent the first hour just in silent prayer together. And the atmosphere was quite different than a sort of a business meeting. And there was a real desire to find ways to cooperate and work together. And then we had a second meeting where we went a bit further, and a couple of us suggested that could we do something jointly to mark the centenary of a Parliament of World Religions being held in Chicago in 1893. And so we decided it would be a year of interreligious understanding and cooperation. And we just decided rather to put it on our note papers and so on. It became known as that. And then we decided we would try and, as 4 of the main organisation, arrange a meeting together. Now, when the 1893 Parliament of World Religions finished, they decided they would have their next meeting in India in 1901. So we decided we would take that up and meet in India. So rather like Air India, we were a bit late. And so there was a lot of work in trying to arrange things in Bangalore, get people on side and so on to work out a programme and really work together. But this was fascinating with 2 meetings. And because of the year, we began with a big event in London, which the Brahma Kumaris, a spiritual university, people we had a lot to do with, they helped to organise that. And then we tried to encourage towns and places right across England to mark it. And it became really quite an international event. And in the event, between us, we organised this big event in India. Mary may like to say a bit more about some art. but we also had a meeting at Cape Comorin in the south of India. We met in Delhi, where the Prime Minister of India took part. Then Mary and I went on to Japan, and then finally to Chicago, where they were also marking the centenary of the Parliament, and we met all sorts of wonderful people. It was extremely fascinating. But you would like to say about some more things that happened?
Well, so many. It was such an interesting year. I mean, the Bangalore conference was of really interfaith activists who were all doing something, and it was one of the most united conferences I've ever been to, where everybody was. It was just terribly exciting. But before that, we had been on another conference with Father Albert, who was a great friend, and while we were there, we went to Vivekananda's Rock. Now, Vivekananda was very well known. Do you want to say anything
Well,
about
I mentioned Sri Ramakrishna earlier on, the Hindu of the early 19th century. One of his main followers was Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda. And Swami Vivekananda took part in the 1893 Parliament of World Religions. And before he went to this rock right at the very tip of India and dedicated himself to the service of my God, the poor in all the world. And he went, and he was one of the great stars of the Parliament. So he was obviously a very good speaker and so on. So it seemed a nice place to start our Indian remembrance.
He wore wonderful orange robes. But the reason we went to the rock was to see his rock, and you had to go by ferry to get to the rock. And unfortunately it was extremely hot. Our son was with us, he was a medical student, Jeremy, and I felt very faint. So I sat down on the rock and couldn't really cope. And they cleared the path for me to get out, to go back to the ferry. And I think there were 3 different people of different religions involved. There was a Hindu chappie who drove me in a taxi back to the hostel we were staying in. And there was a Muslim who escorted me across the island. And then about an hour after we got back, and I got the ferry back, and I was just about coping, and our son kept everybody off. He said, keep away, you know, don't all crowd around. And they did all crowd around, because there were a lot of people on the rock. And when we got back to the hostel, I was lying in bed, resting, and it was very, very hot. And there was a knock on the door, and there was a lady of the Zoroastrian faith, and she said, I think we've got something here you might want. And she produced an envelope, which was an envelope that I'd left on the rock, which had our passports and our money and everything in it.
And our tickets.
And our tickets. And she just produced it. Wasn't that a wonderful interfaith story of caring and kindness?
Well, right at the beginning of the event, there's ceremonial lighting of the candle.
That's right, yeah.
And all sorts of problems, who should do it and so on. And one Swami said he'd only come if he was the only person on the stage, etc., etc. But it suddenly occurred to me, one of our friends was there in a wheelchair. Why don't we get her to light it? And Jeremy, our son, who was there, he wheeled her in and she lit it, and everyone was happy. But it's that sort of thing. And so we only got there about 2 days, a day before, and nobody had really done any publicity. But a friend of mine who had some contacts, he sort of a priest from the North India who lived very long ago. And so the day before he rang up for press, and he actually managed to get us on Air India the next day. So I don't know if one need pay for public relations officers.
But he also took over our room, our bedroom, and used it as his sort of office. Yeah. So it was really quite hard to use it. He and
the clergy were both lying on our bed when we first went in. But, so there were always these side stories, but it was I think everybody went and thought it was wonderful.
And 2 very dear friends, David and Celia Story, helped us a great deal in that. Couldn't have coped without them.
Was that in Bangalore?
Yes.
The Bangalore, and then from there eventually we ended up at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago. Now Daniel Gomez Ibanez, who was running it, had become a great friend because he's involved. And so we were sort of involved in that. And then I was asked to say a prayer at the final event, so sitting on the platform. And and you were with one of the friends, weren't
I was
you?
dancing, we were dancing
and
yes,
so on.
yes.
So it was great, a great sort of move forward, I think, and it sort of stimulated interfaith work.
I've been very fortunate in life in having one or two very special spiritual experiences, and whilst we were in Japan, amongst other things, we did various things. We had to wear white, and we had to say prayers before going on a waterfall ceremony, and I found some of the Shinto prayers quite difficult, so I did say Christian prayers, but we were both dressed up in these outfits, white, and we went, it was about 10:30 at night, very late, and you go under the waterfall and it just comes right over you. It was very cold and you had to walk over steps to get there. It was quite difficult getting in. But once I was there, I had the most amazing experience of being completely at one with nature. I just didn't know which was me and which was the waterfall and which was nature. And that was an incredible experience, which I'm afraid Marcus didn't have because he was feeling rather cold.
Well, I found I had some heart problems.
Yes, you had heart problems.
And the Japanese ambassador let me lie and have a rather luxurious bed to rest on, who I'd met earlier in Sudan, so all these sort of things happen. One of the major points of the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago was this agreement of a global ethic, which really committed us to work for a world of equality and justice and where poverty is addressed and so on. And afterwards, Peggy Morgan and I edited this book to bring quotations and so on from the different religions in support of that global ethic. And that's become very important because it's become the key product of the Parliament of Religion, which has been added on to by different ones, and most recently we were highlighting the needs of the environment.
I know you've worked with many interfaith organisations, and we'll show their names at the end, along with the titles of some of the 50 books that you've written. But now I just want to ask you about some of the special people that you've met. Could you tell me a bit about Desmond Tutu?
Yes, well, strangely, I knew him as a teenager because there were, in our village where we lived, some people who had been missionaries, and every sort of vacation, Desmond Tutu came to stay with them, and he always came to have tea with my parents, and so I was there, and just I think because of his great sense of humour, and a lovely person. And then he came to my ordination, and that was very special to have him. And the next time really I sort of saw him was at the World Council of Churches meeting in Canada, in Vancouver, I suppose in the middle of the 1980s, right at the height of the anti-apartheid struggle. And all that after we were wondering, would he come, wouldn't he come, would the government give him a visa to come, and so on. And suddenly, around about 9 o'clock at night, we were told, he's here, he's coming. And there was a wonderful worship tent, so we all gathered there, and round about midnight he started talking to us, and all the ways he talked about, how absurd colour discrimination is. I mean, if people have got a false tooth, are very different. And he did it with such passion, but always with such humour and real concern for those he was trying to oppose. And he said then that he always prayed for them all every day.
So I wanted to talk about the Council of the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1999, which was the second one after Chicago, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, we have been to all of them, apart from the one recently. And I just wanted to show you, oops, if I can reach him, Desmond. Here is Desmond Tutu. This is a replica of him. And when we went to the Parliament of the World's Religions, we also did a little bit of looking around Cape Town, and we went to one of the townships. And at the township there was a little lady, I think she was Roman Catholic actually. She got lots of little cards for people who were allowed to get soup, because she made a soup kitchen. And in the soup kitchen she had this picture, this lovely doll of Desmond Tutu, and she was selling them for £12 each, and Desmond Tutu had agreed to it. So I bought one, and here he is saying hello to everybody. And he's been very popular ever since he came back to Britain. He did have a wonderful sense of humour. I did tell him once I thought he repeated his jokes a bit, and he said, so long as people go on laughing, why shouldn't I? He had a wonderful sense of humour.
Yeah.
But there is a fantastic book called The Book of Joy about Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama meeting, and I just wanted to sort of advertise that because I think everybody should get it. It's an extremely spiritual book, but also extremely funny, because they both had wonderful senses of humour. But at the Parliament, it was one of the most important conferences, as far as I was concerned, that I attended, because I'd been working with kidney failure, patients with kidney failure, and I'd written quite a lot of papers and given talks in Prague and Barcelona to nurses and that sort of thing. And at the Parliament I presented a paper about kidney transplantation, and I was interviewed on Cape Town radio by a Jewish journalist who was definitely out there to provoke me. She kept saying, oh well, kidney failure, well, I'm not sure, she said, whether I'd like a British kidney, an English kidney. I think, she said, you know, I would prefer a Jewish kidney, and that set me into a rage because of course we all have the same sort of kidneys. So she got me really worked up, and it was quite an amusing interview. So I enjoyed that, and quite a lot of people saw that. But kidney failure is quite a horrid illness and has all sorts of repercussions, and that did come out. But that wasn't, I mean, I was only there to talk about it because I'd interviewed several people, quite a lot of people of different faiths, and I'd done a project on it about their attitude to not only transplantation but dying and how they wanted to die and what happened when they died. And I feel it's really important that all the hospitals and all the doctors should know quite what people need to know about different faiths and their beliefs.
The poll, of course, began with World AIDS Day too. Which
Oh, it did, that's right.
And we had this visit to the island where Nelson Mandela had been held prisoner for, what, 20 years or more, and learnt about him from somebody who'd also been a prisoner there. And from the island, one could see across to the mainland, to Cape Town. So that said, but what he did say when he spoke was how much support he received from the churches, and many people writing to him, a lot of people praying for him. So it was wonderful to have been in his presence, so we put it that way.
Robben Island was very significant, yes, to us. In fact, the whole trip to South Africa was incredibly significant.
And very hopeful. In 1999 we really thought the world might change.
And the Dalai Lama was there. There were all sorts of lovely people there, and we had the opportunity of meeting them, which was lovely.
So another body you were involved in was the Peace Council?
Yes, this was formed after the Parliament of World Religions by Daniel Gomez-Ibanez, who'd been secretary for the Chicago meeting. And he wanted to bring together a small group of sort of dedicated peace workers in different parts of the world who could support each other in their sort of stand against the injustice. And the first meeting was in Chiapas in Mexico, where a lot of the local people were being driven off their land by developers and so on and so on. And there was a wonderful bishop there, and we went and he talked about it and so on. And about nearly 9 months later or so, he got in touch with all of us to talk about a massacre which had happened in one of the remote villages. And he asked us to come back for the dedication of a memorial to them. And this was very moving. I actually travelled in the car with him, and we had to go through this long forest. He thought the soldier army would have a roadblock and not let him get there, but we got there. We got there, it was a downpour of rain, and the only way to the village was down a very muddy bank. And so we had both a Swami and Imam going down on their backsides. But anyhow, they gave us a great welcome, and it was a day of which people there celebrate the departed. And so we had a service in which we had prayers from the different faith traditions. I was asked to say one Christian. But afterwards, the priest there said how much it is meant for the day. And it was one, I mean, the Verdimas massacre, something like 60 women and their children had just been shot dead, taking refuge in the chapel. The men had managed to hide, I suppose, mostly. Anyhow, there was one of the mothers who'd lost 3 children, and she said to the priest afterwards, "The day before I was in total despair, and their prayers have given me hope." And that's, I think, I always feel really the heart of the Interfaith Movement, give people hope.
It was sad, actually, really, because the previous visit, 9 months before, we'd had a wonderful service in the cathedral,
Yes.
and we'd all gone down and lit candles with all these people, who, some of whom have obviously been killed afterwards.
Yeah.
But they were so hopeful and so friendly and just so lovely.
Yes. And then another of Peace Council meetings was in Ireland, particularly in support of Mara Maguire, who was a Nobel Prize winner, who'd been, her sister, I think it was, died in children, and she was then dedicated with somebody, she was Catholic, with Protestant, to really bring the women together to work for peace. And that was very interesting, and particularly we met with some of the people on both sides who had been imprisoned for their fighting and so on. And I think they hadn't begun to learn and experience forgiveness, which was sad. It was just bad things happen in war and you don't talk about it. And then, but we also, when I came and talked at a conference I organised in England with a person called Donald Reeves, who ran Soul for Europe, and that was brilliant. But then we both, because we were members of the Peace Council, went to a meeting in Korea, and we were asked to take either bells or spent bullets, and I managed to eventually get police permission and so on, and eventually we got onto the plane with them. I'll let Mary tell you what happened at the other end.
Yes, well, the reason for taking the weapons was not just to take the weapons or bells, but was to build a great peace bell so that the village where we were going to could ring bells when North and South Korea were united, if it ever happened. And they wanted to make a great big bell of all these weapons. But it was quite tricky getting the weapons anyway, which we got from a friend of ours who was a police officer who used guns. And it got through Heathrow eventually. Well, that wasn't easy. When we got to Korea, it was very uneasy. It was a big red sort of light on our suitcase, and they pulled us aside and said, "What are you doing with all these weapons?" Now, we didn't speak any Korean, they didn't speak any English, and we saw one fellow and then another fellow and another fellow, and they were all just sort of said, "No." And they didn't even seem to know where the village was, where we were going, although we did have a bit of paper saying why it was and what it was for, in Korean, was that?
Yeah.
Or it might have been in Korean or English, I can't remember. Anyway, eventually we got to the 6th person, who was a woman, and I was getting very fed up by then. So I picked out the bell, because I'd got a little bell that was going to be melted down, and I picked it up and I showed it to her and I rang it. And they looked at me, and then they just sort of went and let us through.
Well, 2 women together.
I think they just thought we were quite mad. But the interesting thing was that night we happened to switch on the television, and there we were showing our belts. And Mara Maguire was there too,
Yes,
wasn't she,
too.
showing hers, because we were the only ones who managed to get some weapons through.
But at the time we were there, because we stayed at the time village, we went up to the DMK, with the dividing line between North and South Korea, and looking across, one could see how easily there could be an incident there.
But the bell, sadly, has never yet been rung, as we know.
I've spoken in several conferences, one where they have this great rally in the World Football Stadium, and I was asked to speak at the end, and I suddenly sort of decided not to say what I was going to say. I found two of the things was just so boring. So quite a lot of young people there, I just talked to them a little bit about why I thought it was so important. And then at the end I asked them to join in a prayer for the reunification of North and South Korea. I remember that, and sort of peace. And I told them, as you do with children, to say it louder and louder. And then at the end, the sort of Amen record. Right. I still hope one day that will happen, but one has to go on hoping and working and praying.
And how many people were in the stadium, do you think?
I should capacity about 70,000.
Gosh. So hearing Amen reverberating around that must have been
I've never been asked onto the pitch, but...
And can you tell me a little bit more about Siggy, or Sir Sigmund Stenberg?
Yes, I can. This is going back quite a long way to when I joined the Council of Christians and Jews, and we were invited to an international Council of Christians and Jews meeting, I think in Italy, yes. And I hadn't met him up to that stage, and there when we got to Gatwick, somebody pointed out that he was going up an escalator. He immediately came down, walked down it. And that was all a symbol of the sort of person who could
walked down to meet us.
Walked down to meet us, yes. Was the sort of person who would do the impossible. And he was a great person to work with. And eventually he became a papal knight, which was quite interesting. Only the second Jewish person to do so. It's been extremely imaginative. And a particularly interesting programme is what they call Parliament sponsors. Parliamentarians. Because a group of about 4 different faiths, young people, students at university, are mentored by a member of Parliament, and then they do a project. And it's been wonderful, the sort of bonding between them, because they meet each year and been instructed in public speaking and so on. But it's also interesting how much the MPs say they've learned from them.
But the projects did all sorts of useful things to help poverty and community centres in different areas.
Yes.
And they work both at schools and universities. Really, it's a really good faith active forum.
They had a mixed-up choir too.
And would you be able to tell me a bit about Ma as well?
Ma Java, amazing lady from Brooklyn, who set up an ashram in, where was it?
We're just north of Miami.
Just north of Miami, and it particularly encouraged and helped people with AIDS, including a special home, residential home for children of AIDS victims, and or AIDS survivors. Sorry, I must get the right words. And we were invited there because Marcus was given an award by them for his interfaith work, and also lovely Jane Goodall, the wonderful lady with chimpanzees, she came and she was also given an award, so we had the joy of meeting her as well. And I'm sure many people have looked at her books. But anyway, it was an amazing experience. We spent the weekend there. Ma was a great, determined lady who had one of the strongest personalities I've ever met, and had us all in laughter and control, but very caring, and a whole army of people who supported her. And she even took us to the cinema in a coach one afternoon. She sort of, she was full of life, and she made lovely speeches. But the thing that I most remember was that Marcus was asked if he would do a communion service, and she said, "I doubt very many of them will come, but don't worry, but it'd be nice to put it on." And everybody came from the community, and people of all faiths and none all received communion, and it was one of the most moving. We've got lovely pictures of it, moving occasions that I think that I've experienced.
Oh, it was, yes.
And when they died, and obviously they did die gradually, their ashes were thrown into a sort of under a bridge. So they had a lovely river in this ashram, and it was incredibly moving.
Yes.
One of the most moving places I've been to.
But we also got nearly caught up in a tornado, didn't we? There?
Oh, we did. Yes. Well, that was with Brahma Kumara's community.
No, it was still the day after from
Was
the
it the day
Cash
after, was
ashram. 2 other people took us out to a boat trip there to look around. And suddenly, I forget where we were heading for, suddenly the captain turned around the boat and went as fast as he could back to shore.
Enormous
And we were
storm.
rather annoyed because we didn't see what we'd gone to see. And a tornado was coming and he just got us to land about 3 minutes before it really hit.
I wasn't at all annoyed, I was terrified.
Yes. But no, it was,
It was a wonderful storm.
but again and again one finds spiritual people have an enormous sense of humour
Yes.
because they can laugh at themselves. And perhaps I just add, Marjaya Bhagavati, although she was born Jewish, became a Hindu and was a dedicated sort of Hindu.
And we met her at another Parliament of Religions, which is why she got to know us.
Yes.
So one of the people who I was lucky to meet in Salt Lake City at the Parliament of World Religions was Bishop Bill Swing. Would you tell me more about how you got to know Bill and work with him?
Bill and Mary Swing, his wife, lovely couple. But we were invited over to a service, a United Nations service in Grace Cathedral in 1995, I think it was. And Marcus and I were invited to be leaders of some youth groups. There were a lot of youth groups of people of different faiths, just to lead some groups. And so we got involved with that, and we got involved with the service in Grace Cathedral, which was absolutely beautiful.
It was to mark the anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Charter.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think it was 1995. And that was all very special. But behind it all, Bishop Swing had this wonderful dream about all the religions working together like the United Nations worked together, or didn't, as the case may be. And so he was really, that was his passion at the time. It wasn't really very much connected with the youth groups, but anyway, that didn't really matter. But it happened, and the URI, the United Religions Initiative, grew out of this occasion, and Bishop Bill Swing has done a tremendous amount to start it, support it, carry on supporting it, and it has grown into a worldwide movement of people who are having circulation groups. Is it circulation?
Circles group.
Circle groups all over the world, people are working and doing all sorts of projects. And we're very impressed with it. But we were there at the beginning, we were there at its inauguration in Pittsburgh, so we feel part of it. Although in England it hasn't developed as much as other countries, partly because we do have a lot of interfaith groups over here anyway. But they've been great friends, Mary and Bill Swing, and I wish them well.
Well, and the sort of secretary of the time was a person called Charles Gibbs, who I worked very well with, and he and I were both asked by the Brahma Kumaris at their spiritual university to lead a joint retreat, and that was a marvellous place because the Brahma Kumaris, again, a group which we've known well because their centre, strangely, was in our parish, and they've again that sense of spirituality, but overflowing compassion and love. So, so many groups link up because always what's important is more important than the organisation.
It's the people, and Charles Gibbs is one of the most spiritual priests I've met.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Brahma Kumaris are really special, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know them better
You've
in
been
Mount,
there too,
yes,
haven't you?
in India at Mount Abu when I went there
Yes.
for a week with my sister Sarah.
Oh, they're great
was-
friends.
Yeah, when we got to meet Dada Janki, and yeah, it was really special. They're a really peaceful group.
Particularly the most wonderful lady, Sister Maureen,
Yes,
who organises so much.
And Sister Jayanti.
yes, Sister Maureen and
obviously
Janti are
Sister
just
Janti.
wonderful
Yeah.
people. Yeah, it was a real pleasure. And am I right in thinking that you've actually met Mother Teresa?
Yes, very, very briefly. A tiny little lady. She was speaking at a church somewhere in London and gave a very powerful speech, as indeed her books are very powerful, although there's been lots of ins and outs and questions about her. But as we know, she was a lovely little lady from Albania who did a lot to help the poor. And we did go to Calcutta and see some of the work there. We didn't actually meet her then, but I had the pleasure of just shaking her hand. And what I wanted to say was the story that she told, which is probably fairly well known, is that there was obviously a lot of poverty in India, and she just told the story of one Hindu family who were given a little bit of food because they were starving. And she said, having got the food, they divided it in half and went and took it to their Muslim neighbours who were also starving. And that is what Christianity, what love is all about, sharing with others.
Would you mind telling us a bit more about the Dalai Lama?
Yes, well, on his first visit to London, we arranged an interfaith service for him at the West London Synagogue. And very interesting getting ready for the service, how fed up he was with his bodyguards and everything. He said to you, we're born into the world with nothing, we go out with nothing, we have all this fuss in between. But that stage his English was really quite poor. And I remember one time he started trying to say something in English, and his interpreter interpreted, and he just said, well, I thought I was speaking English. So we met him because he became a patron of the World Congress of Faith. We've been in touch, and once I was asked to meeting with him in Belgium. We really had a meal, about 10 of us together and listening. But I've been also to his centre in India. I've been very significant there. But we had this week's sort of consultation, about 50 or 60 people, and he was there talking every time. And I remember at one event, we were talking about problems of the world. After about 30 people had said their problems all started with the British, I just stood up and said, well, I think I've got to begin by apologising to you all. And then he was also supportive of a peace council, but that wonderful humour, but dedication, because there's no other funny story. Or two more stories. One, I was there, he was giving a talk in Delhi, and he sort of got onto this little platform and so on, and then the platform collapsed. And he rolled around in laughter, whereas so easily, a lot of dignitaries would be highly upset and so on. And then another one, somebody asked him, what do you do when you're meditating very still and a fly lands on you? And he said, well, you just sort of sit still and gently shake your head. But if it comes back, you... But he's a bit so... And we've also once been to Tibet, and that was really remarkable because he wasn't there, but we had to ask first of all I asked whether we should go, and he said, go, but with your eyes open. So I've got this deep love for the people of Tibet. We travelled right across Tibet. And I suppose my sadness is for the people there, the Tibetans, people of Korea still not united, Israel, Palestine. So much more to do, but we've just go on, and you never know, as I think has come up with, incidental events can actually lead to real change.
And so you've spoken a bit about some of the hopes that you've had for Interfaith as you've gone through this journey. Would you mind just sharing if there's any more sort of disappointments or hopes that you've particularly encountered? I know that at one point you were thinking about setting up a centre in Oxford.
After the first Parliament of World Religions, the hope was, well, we did manage to set up a centre ready to try and continue the cooperation between interfaith organisations. The IRF were working closely with us at World Congress of Faiths. Our dream was to build a building which would be a sort of place of pilgrimage people could come to, that people could visit and so on. I think I also remember there was a place I'd been to in India. Sadly we couldn't, well, we had support from Prince Charles and so on, and Tony Blair, but we couldn't get enough money. Well, that was one problem, but the real problem was the local authority refused planning permission because it would have affected the views of some of the rich residents. And we hadn't got the money really to appeal, but it was a lovely... But the work went on and has carried on. And now there's a lot more. There's the big King Abdullah project based in Vienna and a lot of other coordination. But I think it's still important. This is why this International Interfaith Awareness Week is so important. But we continue really to work locally, but to realise we're working also with partners right across the world.
That's what I feel. If more and more interfaith organisations could not worry too much about the institutional side, but could actually work together as people, then maybe the world would be a bit happier. I have to say, it's not a good place at the moment. The pandemic, the worries about climate change, the Ukrainian war at the moment is on our minds, and it's not been a good time. But then you meet the goodness and the wonder of people all helping each other, and the kindness of ordinary people. And that's what's really important. If they can have their say and get their countries together a bit, that would be wonderful. It's so complicated, but the religions need to work together so much themselves to show that it is possible.
Yeah, so that's what I say, isn't there? Don't curse for darkness, but light a candle.
Mm.
I suppose since, you know, when you were a child and you set up your celebration club, really for the end of the war,
It's going to be a wonderful world. There's going to be so much progress. There wasn't going to be poverty, there wasn't going to be starvation, there weren't going to be all these tremendous wars.
But seeing now compared to that time, how much more is being done, how many more people are involved in interfaith?
Far more people are involved, and far more people are more accepting.
Yeah, but it's quite often it is at the community relations level, which is fine. But I think the real inspiration is at the spiritual level, because the deeper, the closer we go to the sense of the Holy One, the love of God, the more we want to radiate that love. And what is still a challenge of the religions is actually to move to that spiritual basis, rather than just sort of being nice to our neighbours. And this is why I think, which is one of the things we've always encouraged, is interfaith worship. But because that's an expression or sense. And there's also saying that religions meet where they take their source in God. It's this balance, isn't it, of love and human cruelty. And perhaps what I'd like to end with is the words of Mary Maguire, who we talked about. Dream the impossible and then live to make it real.
So just as a final thing before we go, I know you've written over 50 books. I'd just love to hear about some of the more recent ones.
Yes, well, the most recent one I've just finished is this book, Meeting Jewish Friends and Neighbours. So it's a real attempt to help Christians understand a bit more about Jewish life. And I've done rather similar books about Hinduism, Islam and Sikhism, sort of trying to help people appreciate their religions. I think this is probably the most beautiful book I did, Bridge of Stars, which is a whole range of little quotations from all the different faiths. More useful maybe for people who lead worship is 1,000 World Prayers, and they are from almost all traditions, including a prayer of the Eskimos. And what was the other one I thought I might just share? Or two more. This was the book I originally wrote before the 1993 Parliament of World Religions, which is a history right back to, well, 1893 and all that's happened since. And one more, a book I'm fond of, is probably the most personal book, A Heart for the World, which I quoted from at the end. And I think all our interfaith work is to give the world a heart.